George Washington is the well-beloved father of our country, the man who led the American Army during the War of Independence, and later became the first President of the United States of America, shaping a union of states out of 13 separate English colonies. He was born at Wakefield Plantation on Pope's Creek in the colony of Virginia on February 22, 1732. At the time of Washington's birth, Virginia was a well-established colony of England and had been the home to English settlers for 125 years. The colony was named by Sir Walter Raleigh in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled from 1558 to 1603. It was Elizabeth who had sent Raleigh to explore parts of America, and thanks to his efforts, adventurous men and women formed the first permanent English settlement in North America at Jamestown, Virginia. The earliest colonists learned to smoke tobacco from the Indians who lived along the Chesapeake Bay, and soon the fad of smoking was being taken up by great numbers of Europeans. As more people developed the smoking habit, the demand for Virginia tobacco grew. The young colony flourished, and it became the world center of tobacco farming. George Washington's first home at Wakefield Plantation relied on the growing of tobacco for much of its income. Although George only lived at Wakefield until he was 3, as a toddler he would have seen the men on the farm planting tobacco, and smelled its pungent aroma as it dried in the airing sheds. Life on a big farm must have been fascinating to young George as he watched the activities that surrounded him. Like most small children, he probably loved the animals best. He no doubt awoke each morning to the crowing of roosters and the gobbling of turkeys. He would have loved to watch the men yoke oxen together to pull the plow, and to see water hauled to the fields to irrigate the young tobacco plants, and laughed as he watched the pigs wallow in the mud. The surrounding woods must have provided a sense of mystery as he toddled along at his father's side, keeping an eye out for wild animals and birds. Just before his 3rd birthday, George's family moved to a large undeveloped plantation, which was to become his home for the greater part of his life, Mount Vernon. The site of Mount Vernon had been granted to George Washington's great-grandfather in 1674. At the age of 7, after only a 4-year stay, George had to leave Mount Vernon to move 30 miles away to be nearer his family's ironworks. Mount Vernon did not become his true home until 1748, when he was 16 years old, and at that time the plantation was still owned by his half-brother Lawrence. 1748 was also the year George took his first paying job as a surveyor for a very wealthy landowner named Thomas Fairfax. In the years that followed, George joined the Virginia militia and was involved in fighting the French and their Indian allies in the Ohio River Valley. And at the age of 26, he was appointed to serve as a representative to the colonial government at Williamsburg, Virginia, a part-time job he would hold for the next 16 years. In 1759, he married a widow named Martha Custis, who had 2 small children. George was able to devote most of the next 12 to 13 years to raising his stepchildren and to running the 5 farms that made up the estate of Mount Vernon. Let us look at Mount Vernon more closely so that we can better understand plantation life. A writer once described a typical plantation as follows.
A large Virginia estate was a little empire. The mansion house was the seat of government, with its numerous dependencies, such as kitchens, smokehouse, workshops, and stables.
Mount Vernon was exactly such a little empire. It produced most of what it needed, from food to cloth to tools. Little was needed from the outside world. The kitchen garden provided fresh vegetables, fruit, and herbs of many different varieties, and the farms yielded huge quantities of grain. Meals were prepared here in the kitchen, which is attached to the mansion house by a covered walkway. This separation kept the noise and smoky odors out of the house, and reduced heat in the house during the hot, humid Virginia summers. The kitchen was always bustling with activity, since the Washingtons were rarely without guests. George said rather humorously that his house was
like a well-frequented tavern, as scarcely any strangers who are going from north to south, or south to north, do not spend a day or two at it.
Family meals were served here in the small dining room, and guests were entertained in the parlor. During warm weather, they would relax on the porch, enjoying the view of the great Potomac River and the woods beyond. Next to the kitchen, but in the same building, is the scullery. Here, dishwashing and additional food preparation took place. A third room in the kitchen building is the larder, used for storing perishable foods. The larder is cooler than the rest of the building because it is partially below ground. Behind the kitchen is the well, the source of all the water used in the house. Like all houses of that day, Mount Vernon is without plumbing. Animals on the plantation were raised for meat, wool, tallow, leather, and milk. In the days before refrigeration, meat and fish had to be salted to be preserved. The salt, plus barrels and fish nets, were kept here in this storehouse. The salted meats were converted into delicious ham and bacon in this smokehouse. Most of the work on Virginia plantations was performed by slave labor. In 1799, Mount Vernon had 314 slaves. However, in his will, Washington ordered freedom for all his slaves. Slaves not only worked in the fields, but also pursued skilled tasks, such as shoemaking and paint-making, which was done in this cellar. The overseer of all the plantation's day-to-day activities was a slave who lived here in this comfortable room, although other slaves had less lavish surroundings. Women spun wool and flax into thread to be woven into cloth. They made clothing, sheets, and table linens out of the cloth they produced on the looms. And others cleaned the dirty clothes using homemade soap and scrub boards here in the wash house. 5 square miles of the 8,000-acre estate were farmed, and large amounts of grain were produced. This grain was ground into flour at Washington's own mill, and the resulting flour was used in baking all sorts of bread and cakes. The excess grain and flour was sold for cash to buy items that could not be produced on the plantation. George wrote about Mount Vernon that
no estate in the United States is more pleasantly situated than this. It lies in high, dry, and healthy country on one of the finest rivers in the world.
The estate was large, and George spent quite a lot of time on horseback every day inspecting the 5 farms and mill. He loved to ride, and was considered by many to be the finest horseman of his time. Because he was an expert horseman, the stables were a favorite place, for he broke and trained all of his own horses. Besides the horses, the family coach was also kept in the stable building. Other colonial travelers chose to travel neither on horseback nor by coach, but in a riding chair, like this. Until the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, Virginia was considered to be part of England, like a separate overseas state, and it was ruled by King George III. The War of Independence, which ended the King's rule in America, began in the spring of 1775, and George Washington was called upon to lead the colonial forces into battle against the English. He forged an army, mostly from the farmers of the 13 colonies, and they were men who were unskilled in military matters. During 7 years of war, Washington suffered extreme personal danger and hardship, and although he was long absent from Mount Vernon, he still continued to direct construction projects there by letter. This room, called the large dining room, was built in 1776, during the most dangerous period of the war. Washington directed that
the chimney of the new room be exactly in the middle of it. The doors and everything else should be exactly answerable and uniform. In short, I would have the whole executed in a masterful manner.
Eventually, the English army was defeated at the Great Battle of Yorktown, only about 100 miles from Mount Vernon, and America gained its independence. General Washington resigned from the Army in 1783 and returned home again to Mount Vernon. 2 years after the end of the war, he constructed this greenhouse, where one visitor said,
"Plants from every part of the world seem to flourish in the neatly furnished apartment."
Facing the greenhouse, he planted lovely flower gardens and hedges. Washington spent the years up until 1789 not only working on his estate, but also in hammering out the new Constitution of the United States. On April 14, 1789, Washington received word that he had been chosen to be the first President of the United States of America. And once again, he had to leave Mount Vernon to serve at the Capitol in New York. During this 8-year period, he was able to create a strong central government for the 13 states, which resulted in the type of republic we have today. He was an excellent president, but his heart always longed for home.
I can truly say I'd rather be at home in Mount Vernon with a friend or two about me than to be attended by the officers of state and the representatives of every power in Europe.
In 1797, he returned to Mount Vernon, and to the familiar setting he loved best of all. Here he was able to enjoy 2 very pleasant years with his wife and friends. During this time, he had so many visitors that he wrote,
"Unless someone pops in unexpectedly, Mrs. Washington and I will do what I believe has not been done for 20 years by us. That is to sit down to dinner by ourselves."
George Washington died unexpectedly from an infected throat here in his bed at Mount Vernon on December 14, 1799, and all of America poured out its grief. He was buried on the land he loved the best, and today his tomb serves to remind us of the huge debt we as Americans owe to the energy and dedication of this truly great man.